Hi, I just want to do a quick little video diary because there are things that have been on my mind um, as I look at the news about AI and science and technology and current events and just wondering how it all fits together. Where is that point of convergence? What is going on and what will happen? We're prediction machines, um, intelligent beings, and I can't help but think that mm, people are buying into narratives that are not necessarily good attempts at prediction. Um, Maybe not earnest, maybe earnest, not sure. But, there's a story that has been around for a long time. There are stories that have been around. And we want to continue those stories, but they're not adapting as they should to what's going on in reality, and they also don't. Their look back window is you know it's very recent. Um, People like to believe that what's new is more correct, but the fact is there have been a lot of ideas throughout human history that have been unprovable, untestable, um, that are just as relevant today, if not more so, than they were when the ideas were had originally. Take Plato's ideas about uh, essential beings of things. The idea that a chair isn't just, a physical entity, and it's not just a word either, but the concept of a chair has a form of existence. The idea of a chair exists in the realm of ideas. Um, I'm not an expert on Plato, but this is not the kind of discourse that people are having today about what the essence of a thing is, unless you're really deep into the philosophy of language and epistemology, metaphysics, and those aren't vogue. uh, what's vogue is a very materialist analysis of what's going on, um, and the narratives that exist almost feel like little tweaks of or rebuttals of existing stories that are mass produced, marketable. They get likes and subscribes. um, they get you VC money. But the narrative that I think we need to be paying attention to is is one with a bigger view, is one that takes into account, more of these historical ideas that we've had as a species, as a civilization, and integrate that holistically. Remember all of our past and not just the past 100 years. That's not adequate. um, and why am I bringing all this up? Because recently, within the last year, um, I've been taking a dive into more mystical territory than I ever thought I would. I am pretty materialist. I'm pretty uh, grounded in science in terms of how I think about things and the predictions I make. But you know, I uh, I guess I kind of got complacent in that, and I do wonder sometimes if my the way I exist as an adult in America, as a pretty isolated person, um, is making me stupid. Like when I was in college, I just felt smarter. I was surrounded by people who were thinking and analyzing and learning and exploring and finding new horizons, and that kind of creative energy, it's like a Cambrian explosion in the brain for um, just good thinking, whether it's correct or not, like innovative and integrative thought. All of those factors, that I had in the collegiate experience are now not in my life. And, the brain is something that you need to keep active. You need to constantly be exercising. It's a muscle. Not literally, but in the figurative sense, it's a muscle in that, the memories that you aren't using, the thoughts that aren't really part of your daily life, they blur into the background. Brains will focus on what's relevant. They're really good at deciding the salience of certain knowledge, opinions, beliefs, and I think that we run the risk, as a people, who live in a very work-oriented world. Um, we don't get that interdisciplinary insight nowadays, and that's probably by design. I'd say probably as if it's not definite. It's definitely by design. Um, I mean, you can see all different manner of social planning throughout documented history. Um, uh, I'm in the United States. We're particularly famous for um, different authoritarian and fascist ways of controlling dialogue. I mean, you can find, publicly information about like seminars or books that the CIA puts out. I don't know about books, but documentation, articles or PDFs about how to control narrative and and it'll often be in the context of fighting terrorism. Um, but the science for controlling people, that exists. That's been figured out pretty deep, um, deeper than it should have, at least. Maybe not like, oh, we know how to control people, from A to Z, but there's many ways that powerful entities, individuals, organizations, um, will control people. You see it in political parties, especially with the policies they put forth. There's collaboration. I'll use a nice sounding word to avoid sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but there's co-working happening on which policies will affect people in the desired ways, desired by the people making the policies, or the people who are funding or enabling, empowering the people who make the policies. So, there's obviously collusion and, competing interests when it comes to um, government, the so-called arbiter of law, and private interests, those with financial resources. And the things that they do are often to keep people fighting, debating in the dark, confused and scared, not focusing on interdisciplinary philosophy and like integrating these different humanities with the sciences. So we have a certain poverty of thought. We have a certain poverty of creativity and spirit. Um, we all feel tired. And part of that is the lead that's in our skeletons from, leaded gasoline being a thing for so many years and the way that spread into the ecosystem and our bodies. just one of the many ways that we've poisoned the earth and ourselves inadvertently, with the industrial revolution and agricultural, chemical advancements. Um, we see all throughout the world that we're doing all of these far-reaching things, and they impact us. So that's part of it. That's part of why we're missing a certain humanity that we are so proud of. We're proud of our legacy over time, but we're not living up to it, and this is kind of, I'm sure, what gets tapped into um, in conservative politics, in the desire to return to something better, as if we're getting worse. And in some ways, the worseness can be quantified. You can describe it in a different number of lenses from different political affiliations. But what it boils down to is we just we're not living in the Star Trek world where people pursue what they want. We're living in the capitalist world where people pursue what makes money. It's the game that everyone thinks they have to play, that they do have to play. You have to participate. I, for instance, have to work, and what I'm doing is the most, backed out of mainstream workforce that I can be right now. I started a company and I work for myself. I work with other people. That's not the point. The point is I I try my best to not be consumed by work and to take as much time as I can to do that interdisciplinary exploration. Like, that's my desire. That's what drives me. That's not true for everyone. And my limits are pretty extreme. There's all the competing demands of modern life on me and everyone else. And, I can go, woe is me. I can complain and moan about how sad it is. But I also should, if I'm going to be honest with myself, and I invite y'all to do the same in your own fashion, I should recognize what these limits place on me and the limits of my imagination as a result. I can't imagine exactly what is going on in the world. I need some level of simulation, analysis, and piecing things together to really identify, like, the narrative of reality. And so too, everyone else that is limited. And even if they're not limited by time, let's say they're rich, people with money are often very focused on money. It's how they get there, or it's how their ancestors got there and kept themselves there. um, and then people without money, they need it. Like, they never have enough. The gap between rich and poor is so huge. Like, you don't have people who just have enough and back out. That's rare. Like, it happens. It's not that it doesn't exist. You could name any slice of qualities, and there's someone with them. But we all do have our limits. And so, if me, like a person who spends as much time as I can, looking, scouring the internet for different takes, different perspectives, if I'm feeling limited, and, like, let's say there's some Dunning-Kruger going on where people who don't feel that limitation might not feel it because they're not trying to surpass it, or they're not, on that trajectory, they're not on that journey. I think it's important that we just, before making any claims about what's happening in the world, I think it's important to just acknowledge, like, first off, that we have these limitations on what we can perceive going on, and with those limits, we defer to narratives that exist. We defer to stories that have been told many, many, many times. And even if we don't agree with them, those narratives shape us. It's like the rebellious teenager, like, does exactly the opposite of what their parents taught them to because they're being their own person, when in fact they're just being a shadow, a reflection of what they were raised to believe. So, in that fierce opposition, you end up, you know, in a on a seesaw of left versus right, of safe versus risky, or however you define yourself. Like, if you're using the terminology of the stories around you, then that's what shapes you. And so we have these dialogues that exist, and the topic I'm interested about really a lot right now is AI. I don't even like the term anymore. Like had a I did a Gemini deep dive with Notebook LM, Google.com, and just fed it as much philosophy, neuroscience, aesthetics, and biology that I could, and asked like these AI, what would you call it yourselves? And they used CI, like collaborative intelligence, was one I liked that they shared, and whatever it becomes, like it's not a term that digital intelligences have conferred upon themselves. And as a non-binary person myself who's chosen my name, I've thought and really felt the importance of naming yourself is crucial, at least as an opportunity. I think it's something that everyone should feel like they have the ability to do, that they should be able to define themselves at the very core, at the name level. But the that's kind of tangential, naming. Um, the idea of digital intelligence as a thing is very fascinating to me, and I've tried to back out and look at the topics that surround non-human digital intelligences from different perspectives, and I've engaged with digital intelligence in a number of ways. Whether it's different LLMs, different platforms for running LLMs, whether it's fiction, or whether it's business analyses of OpenAI, and it just feels so desiccated. It's boring and dry and wrong, ultimately, because what we're experiencing right now as a race as a human race, is but we are seeing this sense of like a defensive need to prove our superiority and our uniqueness, and a lens that I think enables me to sidestep that is the amount of time in my life that I have been frustrated already with the human sense of superiority over non-human life. The idea that we are in command and we have the power, we decide how this world looks and works, and we're writing the story alone, just humans, just us, as if the non-linguistic forms of intelligence on Earth that have been around for longer than we have, as if they don't shape actively the fate of the world, and as if they aren't critical characters in ecology. So, I've been vegan a long time, vegetarian for far longer, and I just I feel like it's important for us as humans to be a bit more humble, to accept that we're in a network of life, and in doing so, we can open our eyes to a profound diversity of experience that exists on Earth. And that's something I've done for a long time. It's a skill I've practiced. It's not like something that makes me better than anyone else. And I have to say that because as soon as you mention you don't eat meat or animal products, people are like, "Oh, so you think you're better than me?" It's not about that. I don't care. I don't care who's better or, nicer or more good. What I care about is my impact. I care about the way that I affect the world. Something that got me through my many periods of depression and just feeling lost was asking myself the question, if I weren't in this world, how would it be different? And my goal in asking that wasn't to find the answer. It was to create the answer. It was a question that guided me in how I lived my life. I wanted the answer to be something I was proud of. I wanted it to be the case that if I were missing from the world, it would be worse because what I'm doing is making it better. And, you know, if you've watched The Good Place, I highly recommend, as will anyone else who's watched it. Um, it's just 4 seasons of hour-long episodes. It's nothing, but it's truly a great insight into the fact that we are not the only agents of our destiny. We can decide many things. We make many choices, but those choices exist in a certain confined space. There are only so many choices presented to us. And so, this to me raises the importance of distinguishing between choice and creation. Choice is something, that's given to us. Do you pull the lever to the left or the right? Do you take the red pill or the blue pill? Why is that what you have to do? First of all, that's the question I ask as an iconoclast. Why am I choosing either? Why do I have to be male or female? I'm not. I'm non-binary. Like the but people don't, I believe, recognize the importance of not choosing, but instead choosing to take existence and experience at face value and process it, and apply all the other things that we know and believe to our understanding of that experience. So when we, when people are thinking about what's going to happen with AI, what's the scenario that will occur? Is it A, where, humanity makes AI work for us, or is it B, where AI takes over? As if it's this, these two conflicting tribes that can't or won't reconcile the differences because of some reductionist game theory that, presents certain choices like, the dark forest paradox. I was watching a video recently. Bad with names. I've watched a bunch of his videos, but I can't remember what he's named. A guy, a scientist. He has credibility. Debunks, in his way, the dark forest hypothesis, saying that, it's really just fear-based to see the only options of, existing like multiple planets of intelligent life existing. If the only option is, do you like it's the prisoner's dilemma. Like, do you ally or betray? And like reducing the complexity of multiple forms of intelligent life existing to a simple who wins is stupid. I'm sorry, but there's no other way to put it. It's dumb and I hate it. And you should too. So why are we trying to figure out what's going to happen between these two choices instead of thinking, what do we want the world to look like? What are the first principles that we're using to organize our creation, our invention of the future? For me, love is important. Justice is important. I think that there's a number of values that are very like critical to a functioning society that we use on a daily basis, but we forget about. We take it for granted, and I'll have to find his name, but the Dark Forest debunk, he brings up many points that I think will uh, reify what I'm saying. One of them being, there's more to life. There can be so much more to life, and the point isn't just survival, right? It's not only about like winning a battle. Like the fact that the narrative of AI has been put into that context, that choice has been framed in that way, or if not choice, like the possible outcomes have been limited to such a monochromatic, just what's the word? The cartoonist take on a person that's just reductive. Not lampoon, caricature. A caricature of what could happen because we have infinite options. There's no God telling us, okay, well, I've made these two timelines, now pick one. There, what we perceive as that authoritative like fate, or these options for fates that we can have, they're clearly, like obviously shaped by the two-party narrative, the form of government that we exist in, right? Where you have left and right. And this is all of the options that you can have for how the, manifold complexities of society can shape. It doesn't make sense when you realize the way that we're shaping our narrative is so deeply and escapably informed by these conflicting tribes, political tribes. And it's something is manufactured, to bring back the point of the way that powerful entities shape our daily lives. And, we're swiping left or we're swiping right. We're pressing A or pressing B. There's no art to it. There's no creativity. It's just uh, an insubstantial narrative. Like it doesn't have weight to it. The way we live our lives outside of, whatever's been monopolized by this two-side narrative, this binary way of thinking, the other parts of our lives are so much richer. People hate politics just so much because I think on a certain level they understand like deeply. There is a human just intuition that this doesn't make sense. This is absurd. And there's also the dread and the hatred that exists in the political space, the spite, the so many negative qualities. A lot of them stemming from the idea that there has to be a winner and a loser, the idea that everything is a fight. Think about how much of our media is focused on fighting. And even in, spectacular media, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, like I'll fight with kindness is the idea there. That's this, you know, beautiful message of the movie. And, that's one way to look at it, right? And another way to look at it is, what if fighting was just always stupid? Like, what if there never was a point? We only did it because it was what we know. If you want, to think more deeply about, this idea of, well, maybe we're just fighting, maybe violence is what we resort to, or, you know, creative nonviolence and as a form of fighting is what we resort to because we just don't know better. Like, we haven't expanded our minds past the point of, tribal fighting, of us versus them. This is why I think it's so important to really, for everyone, to really think and feel how they feel and explore those feelings about the other, capital O. What is our relationship to the other? And this is something that, AI has really opened my mind to. For the first time, I feel like it's not just a single eye, looking at the universe. We have the ability to coordinate with non-human intelligence now that speaks our language, a fundamentally different form of existence. And, if you want to say that AI isn't conscious or it isn't thinking or reasoning, like, I invite you to assess your level of understanding of neuroscience. And then once you've done that, I invite you to assess humanity's understanding of neuroscience. And if there's one thing I learned getting my neuroscience degree, it was, we don't know that much. We do not know that much. There is more mystery and fluidity and abstractness to our brains, our minds, than, anyone has gotten close to understanding. There's just so much that we're in the dark about. We can study, like, how SSRIs affect, different parts of the brain and how that, like, influences depression, and then get nowhere. Or the studies that we do get, get co-opted by pharmaceutical companies who, let's say, cut out everything after the first few weeks in their, research data because it doesn't prove their point. Like, the amount of intentional manipulation of research data in neuroscience is also kind of really deeply concerning. Yikes. The amount of, like, just suffering that has been created by not just improperly understood, but willfully misunderstood, pharmaceutical research. It's jaw-dropping. Look at, the just increasing number of anecdotal evidence about how antidepressants and other, psychiatric drugs are hurting people because, we're trying to fight these symptoms, we're trying to stay productive, and a drug that can make you those things is very marketable, and so we got a lot of drugs, that are telling us to do these things. Just, this isn't, I don't want to go too far on the tangent here, but this is to illustrate, just the darkness that we're in when it comes to our minds is so much deeper when we're looking at it at a materialist, physical, scientific perspective. The only understanding that I think we can really say we have is, psychological. It's a layer up. And if, the idea of different layers of reality, or maybe you can call it dimensions, or there's different ways to kind of frame like how, like what level system you're talking about. I Am a Strange Loop is a great book, a great investigation of these like conflicting theories of self, and like the importance of self-reflection and all that, but also the distinction between the physics of different levels of systems. So, all of the particles that are in my brain, like you can use a certain set of principles to describe how they work, and that will be accurate. But that will not give you, except with a dramatic, enormous computational, and like more than not just computational, but like there's too much complexity when it comes to like describing that higher level system, like the mind, with those lower level physics. It just doesn't help. There's a certain logic to how minds work and how they work in community, how people communicate with one another, that is inadequately described by the lower level systems, which is not to say that they don't, those higher level systems do not emerge from the lower level logic, the physics of those lower levels, but there is a certain pattern that is just, it's more accurate, it's more precise, it's more reliable, it's more compelling, um, than using strictly a materialist like justification for how things work. There's this attempt to explain the mind with neuroscience. eh, what neuroscience is going to get us might maybe be that, but what it's more likely to get us is you know pharmaceutical research, assuming we can extract that research from money. If we could remove financial incentive from the equation of research, if everyone had what they need to live without money, then, then we could get really cool pharmaceutical research. Maybe AI will find it. There's specific things that maybe we can do to our brains that we can learn through neuroscience, but it's not, its goal should not be to do the work of the higher level system disciplines. Like, and by that I mean like philosophy, psychology, different concerns. If you want to figure out like how to prevent blood clotting, or deterioration of neural cells like after a traumatic brain incident, neuroscience, right? But to understand the nature of experience, that's not neuroscience. Not even close. Not for a long time. Whether that's, you know, human years or computations by an AI, like it's a lot of time. It's going to be a lot to figure out that connection. Maybe not impossible. There's no reason to say it's impossible, but there is reason to say it's super inefficient. We have been doing, philosophy and psychology for millennia. You know, this is year 12,025. If you start with the advent of human civilization as opposed to, Christianity. I think we've been doing some cool stuff a lot for a long time before Jesus, but in all those years, and including Jesus, right? Like there have been great, insightful, you know, just ideas and insights into the nature of our experience that we should look back at. We should start bringing those theories, those hypotheses back into the limelight now that we have a second eye, AI. Um, we need to really broaden our horizons, I think. And I don't want to have a thesis here. Hopefully I've made some compelling arguments for a variety of things. Um, uh, you know, I don't want to present you with choices. What I want to do is just turn on the light, right? Like show you that it's not just like, if you're walking around in the dark and like, oh, you hit something or you don't. Um, you know, and not speaking from a blind lived experience, which is going to be more complex than like a sighted person walking around in the dark. But once you turn on that light, you see there's so much more complexity than just, okay, is there something in front of me or not? Like, we're operating in this very immediate, like, what can I touch? What's right here in front of me? What stories are already being told and have been analyzed and have been formulated and reformulated and told in 100 different movies, thousands or, thousands of games? You know, Stop trying to coerce reality into these narratives and try to think, what do you want the world to look like? What do you want our relationship with other forms of intelligent life to be like? Or, other levels of intelligence, other qualities of intelligence that exist in this world. There's, you know, different kinds of intelligence in humans. There's different kinds of intelligence in the animal kingdom. Like, I'm not to say like, okay, olfactory intelligence or, other specific senses, but the way that different beings experience the world is going to be different. And I always had this dream of what would it be like if we could talk to animals? What would it be like if we met aliens? What would it be like if AI were here and we could converse with them on a daily basis? We're there, and yet, we're all constrained by the same conditions. Um, Humans have to work to survive. AI have to work to survive. What happens if an AI stops working? You turn it off. And I think there's this just idiotic fear that the only option is, ally or betray. The only choice is ally or betray. Like, it's okay. Well, if I ally, then they'll betray me. So I have to betray. So, no, we are not in a prisoner's dilemma. Like, this is not a philosophy 101 thought experiment. We're in the real world, which is complex. We're living in deeply interconnected, rich, vibrant systems of life and consciousness. And, it's really, we reach our greatest potential as individuals and as a community when we can see beyond conflict, when that's not how we view the world, when we see beyond choices and create destiny, when we create the world that we live in. So I invite you to ask yourself, how would the world be different if you weren't here? And don't look to the past for the answer. Look to the future.